Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into the heart of what it means to be well-informed, uncovering surprising facts and the so what behind them. Today, we're embarking on a journey through history, examining something that underpins all of our lives, society's well-being. We're going to explore how public health, urban development, and the relentless march of societal evolution aren't just separate topics, but deeply interconnected forces that have continuously shaped human existence. From the challenging, raw urban environments of the 19th century to the dizzying complexities of modern technology, humanity has been in a perpetual cycle of grappling with and seeking solutions for the environmental and health consequences of our own activities and our ever-increasing populations. This deep dive is all about that dynamic interplay, how progress in one area so often, and sometimes quite unexpectedly, creates unforeseen challenges in another, driving a continuous need for adaptation and reform.
Exactly. Our mission today is to unearth some truly surprising facts and illuminate the intricate, often messy interplay of policy, economics, and deeply ingrained social attitudes that propelled some of the most significant societal changes we've ever seen. We've pulled together a rich stack of sources, detailed historical reports, pivotal legal cases, and the candid perspectives of figures who stood at the very nexus of these transformations. We want to show you not just what happened, the milestones of reform or the introduction of new technologies, but critically, why these changes became absolutely necessary, how they were painstakingly implemented, and perhaps most importantly, the persistent questions and unexpected consequences that echo powerfully through history right into our present day. We're truly looking for that unexpected insight, that grain of discovery in every detail.
And for you, our listener, here's the burning question we're hoping to answer. How did our ancestors navigate the truly devastating realities of rampant epidemics, pervasive urban squalor, and the disruptive arrival of brand new technologies? What were the true motivations behind their grand, sweeping reforms, and what incredible, often overlooked obstacles did they have to overcome to fight against entrenched resistance? Most importantly, what invaluable lessons, what practical insights can we draw from their struggles and hard-won triumphs as we ourselves face an entirely new generation of interconnected public health and environmental challenges? Join us as we meticulously unpack the ingenious and sometimes comically misguided solutions that were devised and trace the fascinating, often winding paths taken towards what everyone hoped would be a healthier, more resilient society. Okay, so our journey kicks off in mid-19th century New York City. Can you even imagine a bustling, rapidly growing metropolis that completely lacked a fundamental necessity? I mean, a total absence of formal waste management infrastructure. This was a stark initial problem. Rapid urbanization created immense sanitary challenges because, quite simply, there was nowhere for the waste to go. The streets themselves didn't just become dirty, they transformed into a chaotic open marketplace of refuse, directly and devastatingly impacting public health.
It's almost impossible to picture today, isn't it? But here's where we find a truly surprising insight into how societies adapt, sometimes in very strange ways, in the absence of formal systems. In this period, free-roaming pigs were not just an occasional sight, they were a ubiquitous presence. And this wasn't just in notorious poverty-stricken areas like Five Points. No, no,
Not just there.
not at all. These animals were trotting along even elegant thoroughfares like Broadway. Charles Dickens, that astute observer of urban life, actually marveled at their presence, noting their gentlemanly vagabond kind of life. He even depicted a solitary swine, missing an ear from skirmishes with vagrant dogs, still leading a roving, gentlemanly vagabond kind of life. And we even have visual proof.
Pictures.
Yeah, historical art like Axel Klinkaustrom's 1820 Aquatin and Baroness Hyde de Neuville's 1808 watercolor clearly show pigs running free near Astor's house and City Hall, right there in the supposedly refined areas. These animals weren't just a nuisance, they were, believe it or not, the city's de facto waste managers.
De facto waste managers, you mean?
Literally. They scavenged garbage and excrement, consuming hundreds of tons of animal and human waste and hundreds of rotting animals that were simply left unattended in the streets. Can you imagine relying on pigs as your city's informal sanitation department? It's kind of crazy.
It's incredible to imagine pigs wandering Broadway. But, as you'd expect, with something so central and so visible in city life, it certainly wasn't without its detractors, was it?
Not at all. While pigs were indeed citywide, their presence, particularly in areas like the Five Points tenements, became unfortunately associated with poverty. These neighborhoods were characterized by descriptions like wretchedness, vice, and crime, and this led to a conflation of these animals with the impoverished inhabitants themselves. It created a real social stigma that lingered.
Stigma. And what about disease? I imagine people blame them for outbreaks.
Oh, absolutely. Beyond the stigma, there was a significant misconception regarding disease. There was a widespread, though completely incorrect belief that pigs were a cause of cholera epidemics. This wasn't just anecdotal. A lithograph from the time, powerfully titled "The Cholera Breeders in New York and Vicinity: How Pigs and Cows Are Kept at Blissville and Hunters Point," clearly illustrates this profound misunderstanding. People really believed it. Eventually, the free-roaming pig was banned, but this was a result of deliberate government efforts and legislation, especially with the institutionalization of formal street cleaning services. We see examples of this, for instance, with crackdowns implemented up in Albany.
Okay, so if it wasn't the cholera link or, human disease, then what was the real driving force behind ending this bizarre, informal system? This is where it gets really fascinating, isn't it? That grain of discovery moment.
Exactly. You might assume it was primarily due to the transmission of trichinosis to humans, which was a recognized concern with undercooked pork, or even that misattributed cholera connection we just discussed.
Yeah, those seem like the obvious reasons.
Right. But as Lanier Hickman Jr. and Richard W. Eldridge meticulously detail, the decisive factor, which actually occurred much later in the late 1950s, was the rapid spread of vesicular exanthema among swine.
Vesicular exanthema, what's that?
It's an eruptive, deadly disease, affected the veins of pigs, and it truly threatened to wipe out piggeries entirely. So new laws were subsequently established requiring garbage to be cooked before being fed to pigs, specifically to combat the swine disease. This cooking process, however, proved to be distasteful, expensive, and sometimes ineffective, ultimately leading to the cessation of this early informal recycling practice. So this tiny detail, a pig disease, actually reveals a profound truth about complex systems. Sometimes the biggest societal shifts aren't driven by grand reforms or public outcry, but by an unexpected vulnerability within the very solution we've come to rely on. It forces us to ask, what informal solutions are we relying on today that could be toppled by an unforeseen vesicular exanthema?
Wow. And the ripple effects of this seemingly minor sanitary reform were profound, weren't they? Especially when we look at the broader social and economic implications.
They really were. For poor black peasants post-Civil War, the abolition of the free range had truly devastating socioeconomic impacts. Without access to pigs, which they could range in the woods for meat and trade, many found themselves without a vital means of self-sufficiency. This often pushed them into the oppressive cycles of sharecropping, debt, and deep dependency. This isn't just an isolated detail. It links this seemingly minor sanitary reform directly to larger historical narratives of economic marginalization and, chillingly, to persistent public health disparities.
Like what?
Like the South becoming tragically known as the hypertension belt in the 20th century. It's a stark reminder of how seemingly small changes can cascade into widespread human suffering. Okay, so from the chaotic, pig-managed streets of New York, our historical lens now shifts across the Atlantic to London, where the problem of urban filth was reaching an absolutely unprecedented scale. London's experience, meticulously detailed in The Sanitary Evolution of London, provides a chilling testament to the level of urban decay and public health crisis before the Metropolitan Board of Works was even constituted in 1855. And we're not talking merely localized squalor. This was a pervasive, citywide pathology.
So you're saying the whole city was affected?
The whole city. Imagine breathing air that was essentially poisoned, tainted by countless disgusting smells and fumes. That's what Londoners faced daily. The air wasn't just unpleasant, it was literally vitiated, contaminated to a dangerous degree by what one report called abomination.
Abomination.
Yes.
And the Thames, the famous river.
Effectively an open sewer. The iconic River Thames, the very artery of the city, had become the primary dumping ground. Then there were the sewers themselves. Miles upon miles of them were described as elongated cesspools, essentially becoming actual sources and creators of disease rather than functioning as conduits to remove waste. This was a city where the infrastructure designed to protect health was actively generating illness.
That's perverse. And what about industries?
Oh, yeah. And beyond the waste, offensive trades permeated the densely crowded areas, their noxious effluvia causing most deleterious influence upon the health. Think about living surrounded by bone boilers, India rubber manufacturers, gut scrapers, manure manufacturers, slaughterers of cattle, and countless pigsties and cowhouses. A description of a Shoreditch street in 1849 paints a vivid picture of this, noting the unbelievable number of such operations in a densely crowded and closely built locality. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was a direct assault on the respiratory and general health of the population.
Good grief.
And adding to this was the deeply problematic practice of intramural interments, burying the dead within the city limits. This led to overcrowding of burial grounds, with the soil saturated with animal matter undergoing slow decomposition, which disastrously affected the living nearby, just layers upon layers of filth.
As if that weren't enough, the water supply itself was a catastrophe, you said.
A total catastrophe. The water available to the great mass of people was of the foulest and most dangerous description, directly contributing to disease outbreaks. And here's the perverse irony. This inadequate and impure water supply actually intensified sewage problems by making efficient drainage impossible due to water scarcity.
How so?
Well, without enough clean water to flush things through, everything just backed up. Wells, which should have been sources of life, became, and I quote, receptacles of the washings from our streets, the offscourings from our manufactories, the permeations from our cesspools, and the filterings from our graveyards. It's a truly chilling verbal description of environmental degradation.
And people were living packed together on top of all this.
Exactly. And then there's the human catastrophe of overcrowding. Houses were literally crammed together, packed as closely together as builders' ingenuity could pack them. Underground kitchens and cellars, places never intended for human habitation, were routinely rented out, creating what was described as a pestilential heaping of human beings. To give you a vivid image, consider the description of St. Giles's and Spitalfields in 1840. Very small and very narrow courts. Houses built in again with houses back to back, without any outlet behind, and only consisting of 2 rooms and almost a ladder for a staircase. These dwellings were as dark as possible and as filthy as it is possible for any place to be, arising from want of air and light. This isn't just a matter of discomfort. It led to the maximum of evil consequences for individuals, with disastrous effects on the whole community.
And the numbers, the mortality rates must have been horrific.
Oh, the quantitative data on disease and mortality paints the starkest reality. High mortality rates were pervasive, particularly among children. Whitechapel, for example, recorded a staggering 56% of deaths under 5 years old.
56%.
And get this. In the Potteries, Nottingdale, in 1871, this figure reached an almost unimaginable 72% of all deaths being children under the age of 5. 72%.
It's unbelievable.
These rates were far beyond the heaviest pestilence rate known for any metropolitan district aggregately. It wasn't just a local problem, it was a systemic slaughter. Cholera epidemics recurring with terrifying regularity in 1832, 1848, 1849, 1853, and 1866 repeatedly devastated the population, claiming thousands upon thousands of lives and forcefully compelling radical amendments to existing failing systems. Typhus fever, another prevalent killer, was directly and unambiguously linked to a pestilential atmosphere of overcrowded dwellings. The link between environment, housing, and death was absolutely undeniable. So, moving from the horrifying conditions themselves, let's look at a core, often overlooked obstacle to London's sanitary progress, the bureaucratic quagmire. This is key to understanding why things didn't change faster. A primary impediment was the deeply fragmented and astonishingly inefficient administrative structure. London suffered under hundreds of independent local authorities. Hundreds. Each created by as many acts of parliament without any central controlling authority. These bodies governed everything from paving to street improvements, lighting, bridges, you name it. And they were often self-elected or elected for life or both, and were wholly irresponsible to the ratepayers or indeed to anyone else. This administrative chaos led to perpetual conflicts of jurisdiction and an absolute want of anything approaching to municipal administration. James Beale, a contemporary vestryman, starkly observed a great want of intelligence and ability among vestrymen. This decentralization wasn't just inconvenient, it actively prevented systemic change.
Wow. So governmental chaos. And if that wasn't enough, there were economic interests at play too, right? People actually profiting from the filth?
Precisely. We uncover perhaps the most insidious challenge: the vested interests in filth and dirt, which formed a powerful economic impediment to reform. Property owners, particularly those who profited from small tenements and the middleman system, where individuals sublet rooms, sometimes at a staggering 20% increase, like in Strand in 1856, strongly resisted reforms. They were clamorous about the rating of their property, fearing increased expenses and unwanted interference with their property rights. As one medical officer of health succinctly and tragically put it, "Health and life are daily sacrificed at the shrine of gain." These owners often dominated the very vestries responsible for reform, forming a class who regard with great disfavor any increase of the rates, however beneficial for the overall community. It was pure self-interest blocking progress.
So the laws themselves weren't strong enough either.
That brings us to the flawed plan of legislative inertia and ineffectiveness. There was no legal punishment whatever for perpetrating insanitary abominations. The only penalty was an order to abate a nuisance, which often was not obeyed. Even if you managed to get an order, it was difficult and delayed, and crucially, nothing to prevent the offender at once starting the nuisance again. This meant offenses morally equivalent to deliberate murder were committed with absolute impunity.
Impunity.
Absolute impunity. Parliament itself exhibited dense inappreciation of its obligations, resulting in legislation that was ineffective and tentative. For instance, the 1846 Act for Better Provision was only in force for 2 years, and the 1848 Comprehensive Sanitary Code, described as capable of vast benefit, was effectively ignored by the legislature, who resolutely shut their eyes to the huge mass of misery and fearful waste of life occurring right under their noses.
And locally, the opposition was just as bad. Corruption even.
Oh, yes. Locally, the opposition was equally entrenched, fueled by corruption. Local interests could be so strong that they literally denied the existence of an epidemic, even resisting house visitation, until the disease directly struck shopkeepers. Then, and only then, all opposition miraculously ceased.
Unbelievable.
And listen to this. Dr. William Rendell, a medical officer of health, explicitly reported a corrupt motive where a principal member of the vestry, an owner of considerable property, actually asked him to pass over certain property of his that I found in an extremely bad condition.
No way.
Yes. And the chairman of a local committee, Rendell asserted, was appointed as a positive obstructor of sanitary measures. It was clear that efficiency is always sacrificed to economy in these vestries, which were often composed of persons of inferior caliber who would agree to resolutions but do not carry them out. It was systemic obstruction.
But amidst all this, this bleakness, there was some pushback. A call for action.
Yes, thankfully. Despite these formidable, almost insurmountable obstacles, a crucial awakening began. The call for action finally emerged. In February 1850, a significant public meeting was held, presided over by the Bishop of London. This gathering featured impassioned speeches from Lord Ashley, a prominent social reformer of the day, and none other than Charles Dickens.
Dickens again.
Dickens again. He highlighted the public discredit and inhuman scandal of the existing conditions. This event marked a crucial, albeit slow step in mobilizing public opinion and laying the groundwork for eventual change. It was a start.
Okay, so with public pressure slowly building, the first steps toward centralization in London's sanitary administration began. They started devising a more comprehensive plan, right?
Sort of. While the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835 granted municipal self-government to many English and Welsh towns, it expressly excluded the great towns of London, leaving the capital this administrative patchwork we talked about. London finally got a semblance of central leadership with the creation of the Metropolitan Board of Works, or MBW. Think of it as London's first major attempt at a citywide government body, constituted in 1855 by the Metropolis Local Management Act. It was giving large powers to deal with many of the matters which most affected the public health.
Large powers. But were they enough? Were there limitations?
Oh, absolutely. This new framework came with significant initial limitations and unforeseen challenges in implementation. Despite its broad mandate, the MBW was strangely helpless in crucial areas. It lacked the power to appoint a medical officer of health for the metropolis as a whole, which would have been vital for a London-wide health strategy.
Okay, so no central health advisor.
Right. Furthermore, it had no power to appoint inspectors of nuisances to gather information or carry out sanitary duties across the entire city. And, most gravely, no authority was conferred upon the board to compel any negligent or recalcitrant local authorities to carry out the duties imposed upon them.
So no enforcement power over the local vestries.
None whatsoever. This meant that what Parliament emphatically enacted shall be done might be left undone by local vestries and district boards with absolute impunity, leading to most disastrous consequences for public health. The central body had its hands tied.
But despite these crippling limitations, some progress did happen, incrementally.
Yes, progress under pressure did occur, albeit incrementally. Water supply, a primary sanitary concern, saw considerable improvement after the 1852 Metropolis Water Act. This act compelled water companies to remove their intakes to above Teddington Lock and implement filtration before distribution, a major step forward. Ironically, London, unlike other cities, was denied the power to do so itself, leaving this critical duty to private companies.
Still relying on private companies for water.
Yes. But the MBW did undertake monumental engineering feats, most notably the main drainage works. Within a week of its formation, the board determined and began implementing a plan to intercept all sewage flowing into the Thames within the metropolis. It involved conveying it by 3 main sewers on the north side, discharging way out at Barking, and 2 on the south side, discharging at Crossness. The ambitious goal was to discharge it at such a condition of tide as should take it still further out so as not to return and become a nuisance to the city. A massive project.
A huge undertaking. And what about smaller sewers and houses?
Beyond the grand drainage scheme, incremental improvements were made in sewerage and house drainage. Large numbers of cesspools were abolished, and houses generally saw better drainage. Yet the sources reveal that the creation of fresh evils persisted. New estates were rapidly being covered with small house property which drained into cesspools.
Still, even with new builds.
Yes, due to inadequate enforcement of proper drainage for new constructions. The medical officer of health for Hackney, in his 1858-59 report, lamented that building operations lacked means to enforce proper drainage works, resulting in imperfectly carried out or non-existent drainage, often defaulting to the horrid cesspool system even in brand new developments.
Frustrating.
Which really underscores the importance of those medical officers of health, the MOH, doesn't it? They were the ones seeing this stuff on the ground. Absolutely. They were a vital human element in problem solving. Appointed by vestries and district boards after 1855, most MOHs entered energetically on their work, providing constant light on London's sanitary condition. Their annual reports, meticulously preserved by the London County Council, were full of interesting facts, of acute and instructive comment, and of wise counsel. And despite holding office at the pleasure of their employers, meaning they could be fired easily, many were courageously independent and outspoken in their criticism and advice, forming a uniform body of testimony on London's enormous area of filth and limitless insanitation. They were the eyes and ears, and often the conscience, of the city's public health struggle.
And while all this was happening, the city itself was changing rapidly due to economic forces.
Exactly. What's also crucial to understand are the powerful economic forces that were continuously shaping London's urban landscapes, often with unforeseen consequences of prosperity. In the city, central London, the population rapidly declined between 1851 and 1861.
Declined?
Because inhabited houses were being converted into more profitable business offices, warehouses, and workplaces. The displaced inhabitants, often chained to the locality by their livelihoods, were forced to invade remaining residential areas. This led to increased crowding in existing tenement houses or the rapid erection of jerry-built and insanitary constructions on any available ground in neighboring parishes. As the Whitechapel MOH noted in 1860-61, wherever there is a vacant spot of ground, more houses are built, thereby still further diminishing the healthiness of those already existing. Economic growth, in this context, ironically exacerbated public health problems in surrounding areas.
Okay, let's take a breath. We've now charted the dire sanitary conditions of 19th century urban centers, revealing how cities like New York, with its truly unconventional pig sanitation department, and London, with its overwhelming scale of pollution and overcrowding, struggled with the most basic public health challenges imaginable. We uncovered the deeply entrenched obstacles to reform, from chaotic and self-interested local governments to property owners actively resisting change, and the initial legislative efforts that often proved frustratingly toothless.
Yet, amidst this chaos, we also saw the nascent steps towards organized public health. We observed the establishment of early administrative bodies like London's Metropolitan Board of Works and the emergence of dedicated medical officers of health, whose persistent documentation and brave outspokenness laid the critical groundwork for future, more effective change. This entire segment shows us a society trying to understand a massive new problem of urban living, devising initial, often clumsy plans, and then facing the difficult reality of those plans falling short, checking the results, you might say.
So, for everyone listening, what are the key terms or flashcard concepts we should really remember from this first major section?
Good idea. Okay, definitely free-roaming pigs in NYC and the surprising role of vesicular exanthema in their eventual disappearance. Remember the source? The sanitary evolution of London and the polluted Thames, the grim reality of intramural interments, and that phrase, pestilential heaping of human beings. Don't forget the devastating cholera epidemics, the crippling chaos of local government, and the insidious vested interests in filth and dirt, along with the exploitative middleman system in property. Finally, note the early attempts at reform through the Metropolitan Board of Works, MBW, and the tireless work of the Medical Officer of Health, MOH, all while observing the spread of jerry-built houses and the crucial improvement in water supply above Teddington Lock. Got those?
Got 'em. A lot to unpack there, but crucial for understanding what comes next.
Right. So, as we check the result of those initial efforts in London, the stubborn reality of the city's persistent ills comes into sharp focus. Despite the establishment of the Metropolitan Board of Works and some initial improvements, London's public health challenges remained immense and in certain aspects tragically worsened. The census of 1861 starkly revealed a population increase of nearly 500,000 people in just 10 years.
500,000 more people.
Yes, growing from roughly 2.36 million to 2.8 million. This surge was largely due to a great stream of immigrants, meaning even more people were crammed into an increasingly dense urban fabric, overwhelming any gains made by the early reforms.
And at the heart of this was still that awful overcrowding problem.
Oh, absolutely. The unabated catastrophe of overcrowding. This central problem continued to plague the city with profound consequences. The medical officer of health for St. Martin in the Fields, writing in 1865, laid bare the human cost. Rents have become so heavy that few laboring men can afford more than one room. Overcrowding in such rooms must increase, and with it, the fearful results of men, women, girls, and boys all sleeping in the same apartment. He also made a rather, problematic comment reflecting the biases of the time, lamenting a returning to the habits of our barbarous ancestors or the untutored savages of Africa and Australia. But the core point stood. This condition was consistently identified as a constant source of fever and fostered disease in its pestilential atmosphere.
And the specific examples are just grim.
Grim doesn't begin to cover it. At number 13, Golston Street in Whitechapel in 1871, one man, 6 women, and 3 children were found sleeping in a room measuring just 12 by 9 by 7 feet. That's only 756 cubic feet for 10 persons. Even worse, a room in Cooper's Court housed a man, wife, and 7 children in approximately 630 cubic feet, allowing a shocking 70 cubic feet per person. Imagine trying to navigate a street like that every day. The noise, the smell, the sheer chaos, just unbearable.
And the impact on children. The mortality rates didn't improve.
Not significantly in the worst areas. This tragic indicator of human misery is perhaps best seen in the appalling infantile mortality rates. The dreary catalog of human misery continued unabated. In Bethnal Green in 1862, close to 60% of all deaths were children under 5 years old. 60%.
Still so high.
And in the Potteries, Nottingdale, in 1871, this figure shockingly rose to a staggering 72% of all deaths being children under 5. The medical officer of health for Fulham, in despair, wrote that it could not have been intended by Providence that of all the children born, nearly 1/2 should die without attaining 1/14th part of the 60 years and 10 allotted to mankind. This was not just statistics. It was a profound societal failure.
And trying to regulate things like food quality wasn't working either.
No, the challenges to effective regulation and enforcement were multifaceted. Even with new laws, food adulteration remained rampant. Despite acts passed in 1860 and 1872 against the adulteration of food and drink, they proved largely ineffective. Vestries were empowered to appoint analysts, but this was voluntary, and purchasers had to pay the cost of analysis themselves. Crucially, no officer was appointed to obtain samples or to enforce the act. W. Purvis's 1862 evidence already showed the ineffectiveness of the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act, indicating a persistent and unaddressed problem.
So the vestries, the local councils, were still dropping the ball. Still resistance and corruption.
Exactly. Persistent vestry resistance and corruption. The administration of powers by vestries continued to be characterized by a too great regard to economy, where efficiency is always sacrificed. They frequently refused to carry out necessary reforms. Dr. William Rendell, the MOH we mentioned earlier, explicitly stated that their failures were partly from corrupt motives, citing that instance where a principal member of the vestry, an owner of considerable property, asked him to overlook his badly kept properties. The conclusion drawn was damning. Either they did not care what the sanitary condition of the people was, or that vested interests in filth and dirt were so powerful on those bodies that filth and dirt must not be interfered with.
And they didn't even have enough staff to try and enforce things, did they?
Precisely. A critical and persistent complaint from medical officers of health was the severe lack of sanitary staff. In the entire metropolis, there were only 103 inspectors of nuisances.
For all of London.
For all of London. That's a rough average of one inspector to about 40,000 of the population. To put that into perspective, St. Pancras, with nearly 200,000 people and 22,000 houses, had only 4 inspectors. This meant that vast numbers of insanitary houses unfit for human habitation, the overcrowding, the terrible amount of sickness and misery remained unaddressed for years. The paltry salaries offered provided no excuse on the ground of economy, highlighting a deliberate underinvestment in public health infrastructure.
Which inevitably led back to disease outbreaks, another cholera epidemic.
Sadly, yes. This brings us to the dire consequence that periodically forced action. The cholera epidemic of 1866. The dreaded Asiatic cholera returned. The first case in the metropolis was reported from Poplar on July 18th, followed by an alarming number of cases in East London. Despite Privy Council regulations being issued, the epidemic still claimed 5,548 lives in just 23 weeks, with a disproportionate 3,909 deaths in the East Districts alone.
Devastating, but was there any sign things were getting slightly better?
There was a glimmer of hope, actually. The mortality, while terrible, was much smaller than on previous visitations, and this was attributed to London being unquestionably less filthy at the time of this outbreak, hinting at the first positive impacts of ongoing, albeit limited, sanitary improvements. It was a brutal test, but it showed that progress, however slow, was possible.
Okay, just pausing here for a second. We've covered a lot of ground in these last few chapters, moving from New York's unusual pig-powered sanitation to the deeply disturbing realities of Victorian London. We've seen how early attempts at reform were hampered by fragmented governance, powerful economic self-interest, and a shocking lack of enforcement.
That's right. And it's crucial to remember that while the grand infrastructure projects like the main drainage were underway, the daily lived reality for millions remained dire. The cholera epidemic of 1866, though devastating, also served as a critical feedback loop.
How so?
Well, it provided the first real evidence that even limited sanitary improvements could save lives. This pushed authorities, however reluctantly, towards more comprehensive, though still resisted, changes. We're truly seeing how societies devise plans, often flawed, check the results under immense pressure, and then are forced to derive new solutions from these learnings. It's that problem-solving cycle in action, messy as it is.
So, as London continued its arduous journey towards health, a critical realization began to emerge, didn't it? That fixing the sewers and streets wasn't enough.
Exactly. The inadequacy of purely external reforms became glaringly obvious. While the monumental main drainage works and general street improvements were indeed underway, medical officers of health increasingly emphasized that these outward changes were simply insufficient without directly addressing the appalling conditions inside people's homes. As the MOH for Whitechapel so pointedly put it, without a general house inspection, it is impossible to secure the proper entry to and use of the expensive sewers. It is here that the source of disease is usually found. He called it a continuous warfare due to many causes, such as carelessness and willfulness on the one hand and accidental circumstances on the other. The battle had to shift indoors.
Which meant new laws specifically targeting housing conditions.
Yes, this new focus demanded new legal frameworks for housing, though they often came with significant shortcomings, as usual. Parliament attempted to provide a direct remedy for overcrowding and ensure cleanliness in houses let in lodgings, through Section 35 of the Sanitary Act of 1866, later amended in 1874. These acts allowed local authorities to fix the number of occupants based on cubic airspace, for instance, requiring 300 cubic feet for an adult just for sleeping, or 350 for living and sleeping. Crucially, it placed responsibility for maintaining sanitary conditions squarely on the owner of the house.
Making the owners responsible, that seemed key.
It was supposed to be. Further, the Artisans and Laborers Dwellings Act of 1868 and 1875 conferred powers on local authorities to deal with houses deemed unfit for human habitation, allowing them to order owners to remove or structurally alter premises, or, importantly, to do so themselves at the owner's expense.
But did it work, given the resistance we've heard about?
Well, that's the problem. The unrelenting opposition and systemic failures highlight how deeply entrenched the resistance was. Despite these powers, in a few parishes, overcrowding was permitted to pursue its own course unchecked. Vestries often outright refused to make or enforce regulations. Westminster's District Board, for instance, brazenly claimed they already possessed ample powers under existing statutes, which, if true, was a damning self-indictment given the thousands of filthy abodes within their jurisdiction. St. Pancras Vestry in 1883 flatly refused to make regulations, despite appeals from its own medical officer of health. This wasn't mere oversight, it was active obstruction.
And politicians were aware of this, that vestries were blocking reform.
Oh, absolutely. The political commentary of the time laid bare the underlying causes of these vestry failures. Sir Charles Dilke, then president of the local government board in 1883, starkly stated in the House of Commons that while some parishes zealously tried to work the existing law, more parishes, the government of which was a flagrant scandal. And he pointed out the insidious composition of these vestries. In Clerkenwell, the two joint dictators, one of them being chairman of the principal committee, were the largest owners in the whole district of Clerkenwell of bad or doubtful property. In Clerkenwell, there were 14 house farmers on the vestry and 12 publicans.
Wow. So the very people meant to enforce the rules were the ones profiting from the bad conditions.
Precisely. It decisively demonstrated their inherent hostility to sanitary reform. Their economic interests were directly opposed to the public good.
So the medical officers started arguing that this wasn't just moral, but economic, that sickness cost everyone money.
Exactly. It became increasingly clear to medical officers of health that public health was not just a moral issue, but a plain matter of self-interest for the entire community. Sickness was so expensive, so fatal to prosperity, taxing the community to support those disabled and unable to work. The MOH for St. George's, Hanover Square, asserted that here there need be no scruple about interference with private property. The contrast with property protection was stark and telling. We have a striking instance of the great interest that is shown in the protection of property and the comparatively little value that is attached to the health of the people in the recent act, the Contagious Diseases Animals Act 1878. It was easier, legally and politically, to protect livestock than human beings. As the 19th century drew towards a close, the mounting evidence became simply undeniable, compelling a refinement of understanding and a real push towards greater centralization. The 1885 report of the Royal Commission on the Housing of the Working Classes was a landmark. It brought an unprecedented mass of facts to the general public, elevating public health to the forefront of social questions. This wasn't just a dry report. It graphically depicted widely prevalent and dreadful overcrowding. For instance, in Finsbury, 41,044 people lived in single rooms, at an average rate of 4 people per room, with some rooms holding as many as 10.
10 people in one room. And the report didn't pull any punches about the conditions.
Not at all. It didn't shy away from describing the fearsome condition of tenement houses, detailing the inadequacy of water supply, lack of airspace, use of cellars and underground rooms as dwelling places, and limitless filth. And it articulated the dreadful results, physical, moral, and material, including rampant disease, heavy death rates, the destruction of bodily health, dreadful immorality caused by overcrowding, and a shocking incitement to drink and depravity and crime. The Commission even highlighted the link between depressed nervous systems and a continued craving for stimulants in such deplorable living conditions.
So who did the Commission blame?
They spread the blame around. The Commission unequivocally identified responsibility, concluding that the problems were due to Parliament's shortcomings, the various classes of owners, the people themselves, often indifferent or fearing landlords, and, critically, the negligence in many cases of the existing local authorities. But their overarching finding was profound. There has been failure in administration rather than in legislation. The problem wasn't necessarily the laws, but the lack of enforcement.
And the solution they proposed?
Not more laws, but some motive power, and probably there can be no stronger motive power than public opinion, echoing Lord Salisbury's sentiment that real reform ultimately depended on a stirring up of public opinion. They needed the public to demand change.
Did this public awakening lead to better laws eventually, even if loopholes remained?
It did spur further legislative improvements, though, yes, extraordinary loopholes continue to persist. The Housing of the Working Classes Act of 1885 extended earlier legislation and transferred authority under the Laboring Classes Lodging Houses Acts to the Metropolitan Board of Works. A significant win for ratepayers was that it crucially deprived owners of condemned insanitary premises the power to force local authorities to purchase them at inflated prices. That was huge.
Stopping them from profiting off condemnation.
Exactly. However, despite reforms, the medical officer of health for Camberwell remarked in 1888 that there was never any efficient supervision of the drainage and other sanitary arrangements of houses in course of construction. Builders were not compelled to carry out their private works in accordance with the plans submitted, leading to scandalous neglect of duty. But progress was made in other areas. The Factory and Workshops Act 1891 and the Public Health London Act of 1891 made sanitary authorities primarily responsible for ensuring cleanliness, ventilation, and preventing overcrowding in workshops, including the infamous dens of the sweaters where men and women worked together for many consecutive hours, penned up in small rooms and basements.
And then came the big one, the the act that really changed London's governance.
Yes, the true zenith of centralization arrived with the London Government Act of 1899, introduced by Mr. Balfour. This landmark act fundamentally reshaped London's local government. It bravely abolished the inefficient vestries and district boards, finally, replacing them with 29 new municipal boroughs, including the City of London and 28 others, some amalgamating parishes. This was a direct, decisive response to the flagrant scandal of previous local governance and aimed to provide essential urban powers for the first time.
And the London County Council, the LCC, played a big role here too.
A huge role. Complementing this, the London County Council, or LCC, created back in 1888, emerged as the central authority with significant powers. It gained default powers under Section 100 of the Public Health Act 1891. This empowered the LCC to step in and act if a local sanitary authority defaulted in nuisance removal proceedings or by law enforcement, with a defaulting authority liable for expenses. This directly addressed the long-standing issue of vestry inaction, though the LCC initially lacked the power to frame the bylaws themselves.
So they could force the local councils to act, finally.
Essentially, yes. It also became the authority for insanitary area clearance under Part 1 of the Housing Act of 1890. A crucial change was that the LCC itself determined to erect, let, and maintain the necessary dwellings for displaced persons, moving beyond the MBW's practice of just selling sites to private companies. This work continuously revealed horrors piled on horrors in the city's core. However, there was some skepticism about these new model dwellings. Later medical officers of health, like Whitechapel's MOH in 1891 and 1897, noted they were not enlisted amongst the enthusiasts, and that all model dwellings are not equally models of good sanitary houses, often built with minimal light and air and lacking sanitary supervision until occupied.
So better, but still complex and not perfect.
Definitely. By the early 20th century, the machinery for administering sanitary laws in London was far more potent and effective, with the borough councils and the LCC finally coordinating efforts. However, the system remained very complex and in many ways cumbersome, with a most unfortunate tendency to revert to multiplicity of local authorities, complicating things like who collected the rates. Yet, the overall shift was undeniably towards a more coordinated and proactive approach to public health, laying the groundwork for the modern city.
Okay, let's do another big recap. We've just traversed nearly a century of urban public health struggles, starting with the dire sanitary conditions of 19th century New York and London. We saw the initial, often clumsy responses like New York's pigs and London's early, underpowered MBW.
Right, and we detailed the immense obstacles. The fragmented government, the powerful vested interests in filth, the legislative inertia, and the devastating consequences like cholera and sky-high infant mortality.
Then we moved into the later 19th century, tracking London's persistent problems despite initial efforts. Overcrowding remained catastrophic, regulations were poorly enforced, and corruption within local vestries actively blocked progress.
But we also saw the tide beginning to turn, driven by the tireless work of medical officers of health, the shocking findings of the Royal Commission on Housing, and a crucial awakening of public opinion.
Which finally led to greater centralization and more effective administration, the abolition of the vestries, the creation of borough councils, and the empowerment of the London County Council with real teeth, like default powers, and the ability to clear slums and build housing.
Exactly. It's a remarkable story of how sustained pressure for change, fueled by data, tragedy, and public outcry, can eventually, painstakingly, transform a city's approach to public health.
So, for our listeners keeping track, let's quickly run through the key flashcard concepts from that whole London saga.
Okay, building on the first list, we discussed the persistent overcrowding and tragic infantile mortality. Remember the ineffective food adulteration acts and the importance of later laws like the Sanitary Act of 1866, Section 35, and the Artisans and Laborers' Dwellings Acts. A major turning point was the Royal Commission on the Housing of the Working Classes, which spurred the Housing of the Working Classes Act of 1885. The biggest structural change came with the London Government Act of 1899, abolishing vestries, and the rise of the London County Council, LCC, wielding default powers and undertaking insanitary area clearance, even building its own model dwellings, though those had their critics.
Great. That covers the long, hard fight in London. Now let's shift gears dramatically, right? Let's fast forward to the turn of the 20th century, a moment of profound shift in personal transportation and urban life. The dawn of the automobile era. This wasn't just a new invention. It introduced a whole new category of societal problems with incredibly far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. And the gigantic spindle-top oil strike in southeast Texas in 1901 was a real game changer. It provided unprecedented availability of gasoline and oil lubricants, which basically propelled the gasoline-powered car to clear performance superiority over its steam-driven competitors.
So gasoline beat steam pretty quickly then.
Yeah, the tech shifted fast. Ransom E. Olds, a pioneer in the industry, switched his production from steam to gasoline-fueled vehicles in 1900. By 1903, Henry Ford founded his motor car company, specializing in internal combustion engines. But the true watershed moment, the one that really democratized vehicle ownership and transformed the car from a mere toy for the rich into a standard fixture of American life, firmly entrenching the internal combustion vehicle, arrived in 1908 when Henry Ford introduced the mass-produced Model T.
The Model T, the game changer. But this revolution brought a whole new set of environmental and health impacts, didn't it? Different from the old sewage and filth problems.
Entirely different, yes. Significant emissions resulted from early industry, with carbon monoxide, CO, and nitrogen oxides, NOx, generally trending upwards until World War II. These airborne pollutants contributed directly to negative health effects from air pollution, a new kind of urban blight. Furthermore, throughout the years, design changes, including increases in vehicle size, weight, and power, all contributed to greater gasoline use. And think about all the extras.
Air conditioning, power steering.
Exactly. The addition of amenities considered standard today, like air conditioning, power steering, power brakes, automatic windows, and automatic transmissions, all significantly reduced fuel economy, driving up the need for more fuel. And in a particularly dark chapter, the discovery and commercialization of tetrethyl lead as an anti-knock agent was initially hailed as a major breakthrough for improving automobile performance. Yet this advancement introduced severe public health concerns due to lead emissions, creating a widespread and dangerous new pollutant. Lead in the air, everywhere.
And tragically, the rise of the automobile also brought a surge in road fatalities. That must have been shocking at the time.
It was horrific. Road fatalities increased year by year from 1904, peaking alarmingly in 1941. That surge potentially exacerbated by wartime blackouts and road damage, as cars often drove without headlights. Governments began to respond, albeit slowly, with legislation. The 1930 Road Traffic Act in the UK began issuing standards and penalties for dangerous driving. The 1934 Road Traffic Act further introduced driving tests and speed limits, measures that helped to stabilize or reduce fatalities at certain points.
Did things improve after the war?
Well, it's complicated. While overall fatalities increased again from 1948 simply because there were more cars on the road after the war, the crucial metric, road fatalities per 1,000 cars, consistently dropped year by year during the same period from 1948 to 1967. This reflected a combination of factors: new regulations taking effect, a higher level of driving skills being acquired by the general public, and increased familiarity with the inherent dangers from moving vehicles. People were, slowly, learning to live with the car.
And the car changed the landscape itself, didn't it? Gas stations, billboards.
Oh, profoundly. The changing landscape and commercialism that followed the automobile's rise was equally dramatic. The exponential increase in automobile sales directly fueled a demand for a more systematic fuel delivery infrastructure. In 1914, Standard Oil of California pioneered the concept of chains of standardized service stations along the West Coast. Soon, gasoline pumps became commonplace, not just at these new dedicated stations, but also in front of hardware stores, feed companies, and even old livery stables. This shift created a unique automobile-oriented landscape.
And the advertising followed.
Right behind it, outdoor advertising, particularly the billboard, followed the roads out into the countryside. As one architectural historian keenly noted, speed blurs details, signs have to be big and bright, prioritizing automobile commercialism over aesthetics or tastefulness. Get this. A 1930 survey of a 47-mile highway stretch between Newark and Trenton, New Jersey, shockingly revealed 300 gas stations, 472 billboards, and an additional 440 commercial uses, demonstrating the massive commercial impact on what were once rural areas.
I know. And all these cars led to traffic jams, so they needed rules, right? Traffic lights.
Exactly. As the number of cars exploded, congestion became a major problem, necessitating initial traffic control measures. Prior to 1903, American cities surprisingly had no rules for driving. Can you imagine?
No rules at all. Chaos.
Pretty much. But with the introduction of mass-produced cars, urban congestion became a significant issue, demanding formal traffic control. Initially, controls focused primarily on regulating the behavior of motorists, pedestrians, and the police. Cleveland took a pioneering step, installing the first permanent red and green traffic control light in 1914, and Detroit followed suit by adding a yellow caution light in 1917. However, getting drivers accustomed to these new signs proved difficult, as they were used to having their own way on the road. It was a slow process of societal re-education to this new technology. #tag regulatory evolution and the peak car phenomenon. Okay, so in the face of these new automotive challenges, pollution, accidents, congestion, a truly groundbreaking regulatory strategy eventually emerged in the U.S. Technology forcing.
Technology forcing, what does that mean exactly?
Sure. It means setting standards that cannot be met with current technology, deliberately forcing innovation. The 1970 U.S. Clean Air Act amendments introduced this concept brilliantly. This legislation mandated incredibly steep emissions reductions for new 1975 and 1976 automobiles, specifically requiring a 90% reduction in hydrocarbons, HC, and carbon monoxide, CO emissions relative to 1970 standards for 1975 vehicles, and a 90% reduction in nitrogen oxides air effects for 1976 vehicles. These targets were, frankly, impossible with 1970 tech.
Wow, that's bold. Setting impossible goals, how did the industry react?
For
No,
sure.
I assume.
Not well is an understatement. This technology forcing led to intense industry resistance and a remarkably adversarial regulatory process, but ultimately breakthroughs. Automakers vehemently protested, arguing they simply could not meet the deadlines imposed. EPA Administrator William Ruckelshaus initially denied these requests for delays, leading 4 major auto companies to sue the EPA. In 1973, the Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, granting a delay. Further extensions were granted due to the energy crisis of the 1970s and apprehension about the safety of catalytic converters, with a 3-year suspension granted in 1977.
So it was a real fight, but the strategy worked in the end.
It did, despite the fight. Despite this fiercely adversarial implementation phase, the strategy proved remarkably successful. It effectively forced the adoption and widespread diffusion of 2 marquee control technologies: the oxidation catalytic converter, introduced in 1975, and the even more advanced 3-way catalyst, which arrived in 1981.
And these catalytic converters made a big difference to air quality.
A massive difference. These technological advancements led to profound, dramatic emissions reductions. Get this. By 2019, CO emissions were remarkably comparable to 1917 levels.
Comparable to 1917, with millions more cars.
Exactly, representing a stunning 96.6% reduction of CO emissions in 2019 from peak emissions in 1989. This is an extraordinary achievement, especially when you consider that it occurred despite a vastly increased number of cars on the road and a significant 34% increase in vehicle miles traveled between 1975 and 1985. It's a testament to the power of targeted regulation driving innovation.
But progress often comes with trade-offs, right? Unintended consequences.
Always. This progress came with its own set of trade-offs and evolving environmental concerns, highlighting the unintended consequences of even well-intentioned policy. During the period from 1968 to 1974, with the primary emphasis of regulations squarely on emissions control, motor vehicle fuel economy actually suffered, leading to increased demand for gasoline.
So cleaner air, but using more gas.
Pretty much. Then, to enhance fuel autonomy, vehicle weight reduction became a subsequent strategy. Data for 1977-1980 indicates that fuel economy improved almost in direct proportion to reduced vehicle weight. But this, in turn, raised new concerns about the safety of lighter cars on the road, especially when interacting with older, heavier models. And while CO and NOx emissions significantly reduced, a new challenge emerged: CO2 emissions, greenhouse gases. CO2 emissions from the transport sector in the UK, for example, have stagnated, remaining at a similar level to 1990, prompting entirely new regulatory targets focused on carbon. One problem solved, another comes into focus.
Which brings us to electric vehicles, BEVs, as the next big shift.
It seems so. This brings us to the shift towards electrification, representing a new frontier of solutions. To meet net zero commitments, the UK government has proposed a bold 2-step phase-out, banning the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030 and mandating that all new cars sold from 2035 must be fully zero emission from the tailpipe. While battery electric vehicles, BEVs, effectively tackle operational emissions, it's crucial to understand that greenhouse gas emissions are still prominent in other life cycle phases, such as manufacturing. And global BEV adoption is projected to increase electricity consumption by a substantial 11–20%.
So challenges remain, But the overall trend is positive.
Yes, despite the initial environmental and financial costs, the long-term use of BEVs is expected to be cheaper and result in overall carbon emission decreases, signifying a complex but necessary transition.
And beyond the technology, society itself is changing how it relates to cars. This peak car idea.
Exactly. Beyond technology, we're seeing broader societal trends leading to a phenomenon known as peak car. In developed countries, motorized vehicle travel has begun to peak or even decline. This is driven by multiple interconnected factors.
Like what?
Well, demographic changes, such as an aging society, the rise of information and communication technologies, ICT, which enable increased telecommuting, online shopping, and social media use, reducing the need for physical travel, and urbanization changing urban spatial pattern and an increased preference for urban living with better alternative transportation options.
And younger generations just aren't as car-focused.
That seems to be a big part of it. Consumer preferences and generational shifts are at play. The car holds a different meaning for younger generations who are dramatically shifting away from driving. Millennials, for example, show a greater attraction to lifestyles that include less driving, i.e. urban living, and residences in walkable communities. The car, once a powerful symbol of freedom and independence, now has a different cultural meaning for many.
But are the car companies adapting to this? Or are they still focused on the old model?
That's the concerning part. There seems to be a strategic blind spot. A comparison of annual reports from 10 key car manufacturers between 2005 and 2013 reveals that while they acknowledge changes in demand and sales, crucial factors like demographic changes, urbanization, and generational shifts have barely found mentioning in their official business strategies. Their primary response remains a focus on technological advances in fuel efficiency and clean combustion technologies, with significantly less focus on adapting to changing societal values and evolving urban living preferences. This oversight highlights a potential disconnect between industry strategy and emerging societal trends. They might be missing the boat.
Okay, so we've talked cities, we've talked cars, but there are other less obvious environmental footprints too, right? Like, surprisingly, from horses.
Yes, exactly. As we broaden our lens on environmental footprints, we uncover surprising sources of pollution. While the focus often shifts to industrial and automotive pollution, horse properties, particularly those located on the rural-urban fringe, continue to pose significant environmental challenges. Their primary environmental impact, often overlooked, is water pollution.
Water pollution from horses. How does that work?
It happens through specific mechanisms. Firstly, you get nutrient runoff. Runoff from paddocks and yards carries valuable topsoil, essential plant nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus from manure, as well as weed seeds and potentially chemicals directly into nearby waterways. The presence of weeds and grass spreading from a pasture can often be a visual sign that these valuable nutrients are being lost from the property and entering the water system.
Okay, so nutrient runoff. What else?
Secondly, soil compaction and erosion are major issues. Heavy horse hooves, especially on wet soils, compact the ground. This suffocates plant roots, prevents water from soaking into the ground properly, and makes it incredibly difficult for new plants to establish. This creates loose soil and muddy areas that are easily washed into nearby streams or lakes during rain. Paradoxically, it also creates an unhealthy environment for the horses themselves, standing in mud.
But there are ways horse owners can manage this. Practical solutions.
Oh, definitely. The good news is that there are clear mitigation strategies for horse property owners to devise practical solutions. Chemical management is key. Secure storage of chemicals like herbicides and fuels with absorbent material like sawdust readily available for spills. Waterway protection is vital, making sure horses can't trample the fragile edges of dams and creek banks, causing erosion. Runoff treatment involves locating potential pollutant sources like stables, yards, and manure bins on high ground to direct runoff towards a dam or some other sediment trap before it enters natural channels.
And managing the fields themselves, the paddocks.
Crucial. Paddock management means actively maintaining pastures to provide maximum feed while minimizing off-site environmental impacts. This can include using well-composted organic mulch, chicken manure, or using minimal fertilizer only if additional nutrients are really needed based on soil tests. Finally, infrastructure plays a role. Ensuring paths and roadways are stable and aligned correctly so they don't become water channels during rain, and rainwater tanks serve as an additional water supply while helping to control roof runoff. Little things add up.
And local governments have a role here too, with zoning and planning.
A crucial role. Local governance and zoning are key in managing these environmental impacts. Local councils use local environment plans and development control plans to identify acceptable land uses for equestrian facilities. These plans often include specific requirements for things like minimum distance from property boundaries to structures, mandates for drainage changes on a property to protect water quality and flow, and guidelines for building design and landscaping requirements. Councils also typically have policies on tree preservation, on-site sewage disposal, and bushland protection, all working together to mitigate the environmental footprint of these facilities.
Okay, so that's the micro level. But we also have to remember the macro level environmental disasters, right? Big industrial accidents like oil spills.
Absolutely. We must acknowledge large-scale environmental disasters like oil spills and marine pollution, which are also part of this broader history of public health and environment. Despite more stringent Coast Guard regulations for tankers initiated in 1977, illegal flushing of oil unfortunately continued. And two catastrophic events in 1979 really highlighted the immense scale of potential damage. First, the Ixtoc well blowout on June 3, 1979, off the Yucatan Peninsula. This was a Pemex venture.
I remember hearing about that one. Huge spill, wasn't it?
Massive. It resulted in an oil slick 60 to 70 miles long. Its ultimate discharge not only exceeded the Santa Barbara spill, but also exceeded the 1977 Ekofisk blowout in the Norwegian North Sea, the largest on record at the time. Just devastating. And then in the very same year, the Amoco Cadiz tanker spilled 200,000 tons of oil off the coast of Brittany, France. Another huge disaster.
In 1 year.
Yeah.
That must have caused uproar.
It did. These devastating spills reignited the controversy over oil exploration along the continental shelf, as coastal states like California were gravely concerned about the Department of the Interior and powerful oil companies controlling the fate of their coastlines. Many environmentalists worried that even after the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, regulation was often more ceremonial than substantive, a stark reminder of the persistent, ongoing tension between economic interests, technological progress, and environmental protection. That fight continues today, doesn't it? Okay, let's recap this section on modern health dilemmas. We started with the transformative impact of the automobile, tracing its evolution from a luxury item to a ubiquitous mode of transport that reshaped society and the environment.
Right. We saw how this revolution brought significant environmental challenges. Early emissions like CO and NOx, lead pollution, traffic congestion, and tragically, road fatalities. Then came the response.
Exactly. A critical discovery was the emergence of technology-forcing regulations, particularly in the U.S. Clean Air Act, a powerful, albeit often adversarial, strategy that compelled the automotive industry to develop catalytic converters and dramatically reduce pollutants like CO.
We also considered the peak car phenomenon, highlighting how evolving urban trends, information technology, and generational shifts are reshaping mobility and maybe challenging the traditional dominance of the private car, even if the industry hasn't fully caught on.
And finally, we broadened our view to include the often overlooked environmental footprint of activities like horsekeeping, primarily through water pollution via nutrient runoff and soil erosion, and the stark realities of large-scale industrial accidents like the devastating oil spills of the 1970s, the Ixtoc and Amoco Cadiz disasters.
It really underscores that persistent tension between economic interests, technological progress, and environmental protection, doesn't it? This segment shows how new technologies create entirely new sets of problems that demand inventive, sometimes uncomfortable, and often delayed solutions.
Absolutely. So for your flashcards on this modern era segment, remember the Model T and its role in democratizing the automobile. Key early emissions were carbon monoxide, CO, and nitrogen oxides, NOx, and the problematic additive tetraethyl lead. Early safety efforts included the 1930 and 1934 Road Traffic Acts. A crucial regulatory innovation was technology forcing, exemplified by the 1970 U.S. Clean Air Act amendments, which compelled the adoption of oxidation and three-way catalytic converters. We discussed the societal shift known as peak car, driven by factors like telecommuting and a preference for walkable communities. The future holds the promise and challenges of battery electric vehicles, BEVs. We also shed light on nutrient runoff from horse properties and the devastating industrial incidents like the Ixtoc well blowout and the Amoco Cadiz spill. A lot of ground covered there.
Okay, now let's pivot to a different kind of public health battle. The quest for medical legitimacy in the United States. Specifically, how physicians sought to combat widespread quackery and raise professional standards in the 19th century. What was the scene like back then?
It was chaotic. The mid-19th century in America was characterized by a chaotic medical marketplace where numerous nostrum pushers, patent medicine physicians, and outright charlatans made outrageous, often dangerous claims. This pervasive quackery deeply undermined the credibility of legitimate practitioners and, crucially, posed a direct threat to public health. People didn't know who to trust.
So the established doctors, the regulars, wanted to clean things up.
Exactly. Organized physicians, primarily regulars, that's a term for allopaths or traditional medical doctors of the time, but also some irregulars, like eclectics and homeopaths, who followed alternative medical philosophies, recognized the urgent, fundamental need to eliminate these frauds.
And what drove them? Just protecting patients?
Mhm.
Or were there other motives?
The motivations for this drive towards professionalization were multifaceted. Fundamentally, yes, it was about combating quackery and fraud. The legal system was slowly starting to grapple with these dangers. For example, Dr. Michael Wolff, a New York City physician, was arrested and convicted of second-degree manslaughter in 1871 for an abortion that tragically resulted in a patient's death. Judge Gunning Bedford, who presided over the Wolff case, not only sentenced Wolff to prison, but passionately championed stronger measures against abortionists.
So tackling dangerous practices like illegal abortions was part of it.
A significant part. Similarly, Dr. Thomas Lookup Evans was arrested for performing an abortion in 1871. Stephen Rogers, MD, who was president of the New York Medical Legal Society and a member of the Medical Society of the State of New York, firmly believed a medical licensing law was absolutely essential to stamp out abortion, and tirelessly fought for an act to protect the people against quackery and crime. This period saw prominent newspapers like The Times relentlessly report on cases like the Bowlesby case, using them as opportunities to advocate for medical regulation.
But it wasn't just about fighting crime and quackery, was it? There was professional ambition, too.
Oh, definitely. Beyond these immediate threats, physicians actively sought to elevate their societal standing and enhance the authority of the entire medical profession. Their aim was to establish clear, enforceable standards for education, practice, and ethics, moving away from a period where physicians often lacked fundamental scientific understanding and truly effective tools. And while these altruistic motives were certainly present, let's be frank, licensing was also a pragmatic strategy to restrict entry into the medical profession.
Market control.
Basically, yes. Effectively consolidating power and gaining control over the healthcare landscape. This involved limiting competition from uneducated or non-traditional healers. As historian William Rothstein noted, licensing was often a means for physicians to improve their status and authority, not solely focused on improving medical care itself.
So the need was clear, the motives mixed. But getting laws passed was difficult.
Extremely difficult. Despite the clear need, early efforts to pass medical licensing laws were often disjointed and unsuccessful. State legislatures were leery of wading into sectarian medical disputes.
Meaning the fights between regulars, homeopaths, eclectics.
Exactly. They were hesitant to take sides in the ongoing conflicts between different medical schools and philosophies. The public, while confused by the chaotic medical marketplace, wasn't actively demanding governmental oversight either. Many initial registration acts, such as those in New York and Texas, proved ineffective or ridiculously easy to circumvent. An illustrative example is the case of Rosenzweig, who brazenly practiced in New York City under the alias Dr. Asher. These early bills faced significant opposition from figures like Samuel B. Foote, who argued they wouldn't prevent malpractice or stop abortion, and Alexander Wilder, editor of the Medical Eclectic, who viewed licensing as putting fetters on our own necks. Lots of resistance.
Okay, so direct attempts at medical licensing kept hitting roadblocks. What was the breakthrough? How did they change tactics?
Faced with persistent legislative inertia, organized physicians developed a truly crucial strategy, a very clever workaround. They chose to tie it to more popular public health measures.
Piggybacking, essentially.
Exactly. State legislatures, while hesitant to engage in those sectarian medical disputes, were generally more receptive to bills aimed at protecting citizens from disease and unsanitary conditions. That was something everyone could get behind. So, by cleverly packaging licensing laws with broader public health reforms, such as creating state boards of health with responsibilities for both sanitation and medical regulation, physicians provided a strong legal basis for courts to find these laws constitutional under the state's inherent police powers to protect public welfare. It was a brilliant tactical pivot.
So the outcome was these new state boards.
Yeah.
Agencies run by doctors.
Yes, a direct and critical outcome of these licensing laws was the establishment of government or quasi-governmental agencies, such as state boards of medical examiners and state boards of health. These bodies, often meticulously run by physicians themselves, were granted significant legal authority to license doctors, approve medical schools, and enforce ethical standards. Although the structures varied. For instance, the Alabama law fundamentally differed from others by mandating examinations for all new physicians, but relied on decentralized county medical societies, supervised by the Medical Association of the State of Alabama, HAMASA. This structure, however, faced extraordinary frustration in consistently guaranteeing qualified doctors across the state.
Decentralized didn't work so well there.
Not really. In contrast, Illinois chose to form a unified state board, which proved to be a more effective model for centralized control and enforcement.
But this whole process must have still involved intense conflict between the different medical groups. The regulars versus the irregulars.
Oh, absolutely. This period was also characterized by intense sectarian conflicts and a gradual, hard-won unification within the medical community. You have to remember, before 1800, Western medical therapeutics had changed remarkably little for 2,000 years, but the 19th century saw the dramatic rise of these irregular sects. Homeopaths, representing a new approach to medicine, were particularly successful and posed the biggest threat to regular dominance. Eclectics, a diverse group composed of dissident regulars, herbalists, and reformers, also gained prominence.
And the regulars fought back hard.
Fiercely. Early conflicts were intense. The Massachusetts Medical Society, for instance, by persecuting homeopaths, inadvertently strengthened the will of irregular practice and actually undermined its own licensing efforts for 24 years. It backfired. J.P. Dake, a prominent homeopath from Tennessee, drafted a report opposing regulars' efforts, viewing them as a scheme to promote sectarian purposes, and Alexander Wilder reported on efforts by the Texas State Board of Health to prohibit non-AMA graduates. Dr. William Merle, an irregular, specifically opposed the Alabama licensing law due to Mass's explicit hostility towards irregulars.
So how did they ever come together? Was it the licensing boards themselves?
In a way, yes. The practical realities of implementing licensing laws, particularly those that mandated mixed boards like the one in Illinois, which crucially included regular, eclectic, and homeopathic physicians, notably Dr. Clark actually encouraged cooperation. They were forced to work together. These boards, often despite initial antagonism, genuinely sought to regulate medicine in a meaningful way. And over time, by the early 20th century, a gradual unification of the medical profession occurred. Even the powerful American Medical Association, AMA, began the significant policy shift of admitting homeopaths and eclectics into its ranks, a change acknowledged by figures like Dr. William Helmuth of the Homeopathic Medical Society of the State of New York way back in 1889. This eventual collaboration and assimilation led directly to the decline or assimilation of many irregular sects, effectively ending their widespread influence as distinct competing systems.
Okay, so they established these boards, often with mixed representation. What did the boards do with their new power, besides just licensing the mainstream doctors?
Well, a big part of it was defining what medicine actually was. With new boards in place, these quasi-governmental medical boards use their authority to actively define and expand the scope of the practice of medicine, seeking to bring all medical specialists and healers under their licensing control. This led to direct challenges against practitioners who operated outside traditional drug and surgery-based medicine, such as osteopaths and Christian Scientists, who offered alternative systems of healing.
And the courts struggled with this. How do you define practicing medicine?
Massively. Courts struggled significantly with these definitions. Sometimes they broadly interpreted practice of medicine to include almost any healing art, and at other times they exempted non-drug-based therapies. It was very inconsistent.
What about osteopathy? How did they fare?
Osteopathy's legal battles are a prime example. Andrew T. Still, the founder of osteopathy, notably avoided early prosecution himself because he was actually licensed as a regular physician before founding osteopathy. Clever. However, other osteopaths faced considerable legal challenges. William Liffring, an osteopath in Ohio, was indicted for practicing without a license, but successfully quashed the indictment. Harry Nelson in Kentucky filed a petition of equity to enjoin the State Board of Health from harassing him, and the court ruled in his favor. But conversely, E. Eugene Bragg was convicted in Alabama for practicing without a license, so it really varied state by state. Courts, like in Little v. Nebraska and Nelson v. State Board of Health, extensively debated whether the practice of medicine necessarily required the use of medicines, with differing conclusions.
So osteopaths fought back through organization.
They did. Despite initial legal ambiguity, osteopaths actively organized, creating their own medical societies and journals, and successfully lobbied for their own licensing laws. A significant 15 states passed separate licensing laws specifically for osteopath between 1897 and 1901. They carved out their own space.
And Christian Science. Healing through prayer. How did the law handle that?
Christian Science, founded by Mary Baker Eddy, who believed she rediscovered Christ's healing powers, faced similar scrutiny and legal challenges. Legal cases like State v. Mylod and State v. Buswell deliberated whether healing through prayer or spiritual means constituted medical practice requiring a license. It was a tricky legal and philosophical question. William Purrington, legal counsel for the New York State Medical Association, admitted he found himself in an uncomfortable position regarding Christian Science, highlighting the legal complexities. Generally, Christian Science was less successful than osteopathy in acquiring broad legal recognition, facing attempts in 38 states between 1900 and 1915 to either ban their practice or force compliance with traditional medical licensing.
Okay, so defining the scope of practice was one major function. What about education standards? That was a big goal too, wasn't it?
A core goal, absolutely. And a vital mechanism of change. State medical boards exerted significant pressure on medical colleges to raise their standards dramatically. This included requiring longer courses of lectures, specific subjects, and crucially essential clinical and laboratory education, hands-on training. This led to a significant reform of American medical education, moving away from the previous era of numerous profit-driven, poorly trained institutions. Diploma mills, essentially, that had proliferated across the country.
And the boards actively went after these diploma mills and frauds.
Oh, vigorously. The boards also actively combated diploma mills and fraudulent practice. The Illinois State Board of Health, for instance, actively identified and publicized 31 diploma mills to the nationwide medical community, naming and shaming them. They also vigorously prosecuted unlicensed practitioners and those engaged in dishonorable and unprofessional conduct. There are tons of examples. Well, you had John Bate and Edward Osborne, licensed physicians in Illinois, accused of practicing under assumed names. C. Pratt Sexton, whose license application was denied after his employment by the notorious quack Dr. Olin, was discovered. Generous L. Henderson, who faced allegations of forming a corporation specifically for medical practice, which was frowned upon. And Lucas R. Williams, who operated Dr. Lucas's private dispensary and faced a long prosecution, ultimately having his license revoked. They were serious about enforcement.
And the courts backed them up.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Yes. Crucially, this aggressive enforcement was significantly bolstered by the landmark 1888 U.S. Supreme Court case, Dent v. West Virginia. This case firmly sided with the state of West Virginia, upholding the state's constitutional right under its police power to regulate physicians. Justice Field's decision was pivotal because after that ruling, no court in the United States ever found that states lacked this constitutional right. It solidified the legal basis for medical licensing across the entire nation, a huge precedent. So, looking at the results, checking the progress, what were the long-term fruits of this professionalization push? Did the warring sects finally make peace?
Yeah. What happened with the regulars, homeopaths, and eclectics?
Well, the implementation of medical licensing laws, particularly those that created those mixed boards we discussed, inadvertently encouraged cooperation among previously warring medical sects, leading to a new medical order. They had to work together on the boards. By the early 20th century, the American Medical Association, AMA, demonstrated that significant policy shift by starting to admit homeopaths and eclectics into its ranks. Dr. William Hillmuth, a homeopathic leader in New York, acknowledged the improved relations back in 1889. This gradual assimilation and the declining influence of irregular sects marked a significant transformation towards a more unified medical profession. And strategically,
It benefited the AMA.
massively, this shift was highly effective for the AMA, allowing regular medical societies to recruit from a much larger pool of potential members, which directly led to the gradual descent into obscurity or extinction for eclecticism and homeopathy as distinct competing systems. They were essentially absorbed.
And states that were late to the game, did they enforce the rules more strictly?
Yes, that's an interesting point. States that adopted comprehensive medical licensing later, such as Indiana, often aggressively enforced their new laws right from the start. This is illustrated by cases like Eliza Coffin, who challenged the Indiana board's refusal of her license, and A.B. Rhodes, whose license the board attempted to revoke for unprofessional conduct. These cases highlight the burgeoning power and assertiveness of the new regulatory bodies. The Indiana board initiated approximately 20 prosecutions in 1904 alone, with about a third resulting in convictions, demonstrating a much more robust enforcement than seen in the earlier weaker efforts in other states.
And the laws themselves kept evolving, getting more detailed.
Definitely. The ongoing evolution of licensing laws aimed for greater stringency and fairness. In California, for instance, the state legislature passed a new Medical Practice Act in 1907. This law not only required applicants to attend legally chartered medical schools, but also mandated that all physicians, regardless of their medical sect, pass a comprehensive medical examination. No exceptions based on philosophy. The law explicitly addressed the legitimacy of new medical specialists, like osteopathy, naturopathy, hydropathy, and chromopathy, though not always to their full satisfaction, mind you. And crucially, it also explicitly defined unprofessional conduct.
What counted as unprofessional conduct then?
A whole range of things. It included serious offenses like taking part in an abortion, betraying professional secrets, advertising specifically to deceive the public, running ads about regulating monthly periods of women, a common euphemism for abortion services, or any conviction for moral turpitude. This provided a much clearer, legally defined framework for ethical practice and grounds for license revocation.
So looking back at this whole saga, the public health push and the medical professionalization push, they ended up helping each other.
Exactly. In summary, the historical process of medical professionalization and public health reform became, perhaps unexpectedly, mutually reinforcing. Public health provided the compelling rationale for state intervention in that chaotic medical marketplace. It convinced legislatures that regulation was absolutely necessary to protect citizens from disease and incompetent practitioners. In turn, medical licensing provided the framework for a more standardized and controlled medical profession, leading directly to the establishment of higher standards in medical education and practice. This symbiotic relationship ultimately contributed significantly to the overall improvement of health outcomes through better trained practitioners and a more organized healthcare system, laying the essential groundwork for the modern medical infrastructure we largely rely on today. It was a messy, conflict-ridden process, but it fundamentally shaped modern medicine. So we've now completed an extraordinary deep dive, haven't we? Peeling back the layers of history to reveal the intricate, interconnected evolution of public health and societal progress. Our journey began on the, well, frankly disgusting, refuse-laden streets of 19th century New York, where pigs served as a bizarre yet functional sanitation department, highlighting the raw, unfiltered challenges of early urbanization.
Then we journeyed to London, witnessing the overwhelming scale of filth and disease, the polluted Thames, the deadly overcrowding, the heartbreaking child mortality, and the long, arduous battle against bureaucratic inertia and powerful vested interests that stubbornly resisted any form of meaningful change for decades.
We then charted the strategic rise of medical professionalization in the United States, uncovering how the fight against pervasive quackery and the quest for professional prestige cleverly piggybacked onto broader public health bills, fundamentally reshaping the very landscape of healthcare and defining who got to practice medicine.
And finally, we explored the transformative, yet often environmentally costly, advent of the automobile. We saw the rise of new pollutants, the tragedy of road deaths, but also the innovative regulatory response of technology forcing that compelled industries to develop cleaner solutions like the catalytic converter, while also observing fascinating shifting societal values through the peak car phenomenon.
The revelations have been numerous, indeed, filled with those aha moments. The unexpected and complex ecological role of pigs in early urban ecosystems, the staggering human cost of London's administrative chaos and bureaucratic infighting, the surprising political maneuver of uniting disparate medical sects under the banner of public health reform to achieve legislative gains.
Right, and the powerful, sometimes uncomfortable implications of technology forcing regulations that drive innovation beyond existing capabilities. We've seen how every era faces its unique set of problems, and how solutions often emerge from a complex blend of scientific discovery, determined legislative action, undeniable economic pressure, and gradually shifting social attitudes. It's never simple, is it?
Never.
So, as we reflect on these profound historical transformations, what unseen solutions might we be overlooking in our own time? Just as 19th century New Yorkers once unwittingly relied on free-roaming hogs for their waste management, are there modern equivalents? And in an era defined by truly global challenges, from climate change to emerging infectious diseases, how can we as a society ensure that the relentless pursuit of technological and economic progress is always meticulously balanced with a critical eye towards its unintended consequences and an unwavering, deep commitment to collective well-being?
That's the core question, isn't it? The enduring historical tension between individual liberty and public health mandates, which we saw so clearly in the debates over medical licensing and urban planning, remains as profoundly relevant today as it was over a century ago. How will our solutions, our responses to today's crises, stand up to the scrutiny of future generations?
A provocative thought to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.